So welcome everyone to this evening's webinar. I'm Bob Friedlander, the chair of the board of New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action. Before we get started, I just want to mention 3 upcoming webinars that we have scheduled for next month, in case some of them are of interest to you. On May 12th, we have Restoring Ecosystems, Restoring Ourselves, presented by Dr. Perkins from Seattle Children's Hospital, founder of Pediatricians for Climate Action, and Dr. Fleischer, a pediatric endocrinologist from Maine Medical Center. On May 16th, we have a webinar entitled Air Quality and Lung Health, presented by Laura Kate Bender, who's the National Assistant Vice President of Healthy Air with the American Lung Association. And on May 26th, we have a webinar entitled Youth Mental Health and Climate Change, Strategies to Support Coping at the Intersection of Two Crises. That will be presented by Dr. Elizabeth Pinsky, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist and pediatrician at the MGH. So a lot happening next month. In addition to the Project Echo on climate and health we're doing with Dartmouth and the New Hampshire Medical Society, we had our first session today, which went real well. And we're looking forward to the next 5 sessions of that. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to introduce Pam DiNapoli. Pam is the executive director of the New Hampshire Nurses Association, and she will be introducing our speaker, Katie Huffling, and moderating the question and answer period to follow. So Pam, it's up to you now.
All right, thanks, Bob. So tonight we're really fortunate to have Dr. Katie Huffling as our presenter for the topic of water and health. Katie is a certified nurse midwife and the executive director of the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environment, ANHE. With ANHE, Dr. Huffling works with nurses and nursing organizations to elevate environmental health issues such as climate change, toxic chemicals, and sustainability in healthcare amongst the nursing profession. Dr. Huffling received her DNP in Health Innovation and Leadership from the University of Minnesota. In 2020, she was appointed as a member of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Children's Health Protection Advisory Council. Dr. Huffling was an editor of the environmental health e-textbook, Environmental Health in Nursing, that won the 2017 American Journal of Nursing Book of the Year in Environmental Health. She was also the recipient of the 2018 Charlotte Brody Award, which recognizes nurses who go beyond everyday nursing endeavors to proactively promote and protect environmental health. And one of the best things is that she is from New Hampshire. So Katie, Dr. Huffling will do her presentation. As you have questions, if you can put them in the chat. At the end of her presentation, we'll have a facilitated question and answer session. So Dr. Huffling, if you're ready, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so great to be here with other New Hampshire folks. My mom and brother still live in New Hampshire, so I'm up there fairly frequently. Can you see my slides okay? Great. So I'm mostly focused today on the climate and issues around water, but I do touch a little bit on some other water issues because I think they're all kind of interconnected. There's so many of these things that have that relate to one another. It's really hard to tease out all of the different pieces. But just to give you a little information on my organization, the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, we work with nurses and nursing organizations, other health organizations and policy and advocacy groups around the country on a variety of environmental health issues. Like if it has to do with environment and health, we're probably working on it. We're free to join, and anyone is welcome to sign up for our newsletter. We're always sending out lots of great information and things that are of interest to health professionals. So when I was pulling together my talk for today, I was thinking about what happened in my hometown of Alstead in 2005, right around Hurricane Katrina, where a culvert backed up during a really heavy few days of rain and caused massive flooding throughout the town. It really changed the geography of the town. Like, it's totally different now in some areas, new roads, many houses gone, several people died. And as a rural community, it was really, besides just the, loss of community, it's financially really challenging for a small community. And this is something that we're going to be seeing more and more of with climate change. And flooding is actually New Hampshire's most common and costly natural disaster. And as we know, with climate change, it's really changing extreme weather events. And so this is something that New Hampshire is really going to have to be facing. And then I couldn't believe it, in September of 2021, they had another massive amount of flood in that area, where they had 6 inches of rainfall in about an hour. And, as many of you know, in some of these rural areas in New Hampshire, you don't have many routes to get around. So my brother lives in Ackworth, my mother in Alstead. It's normally like a 5-minute drive between their houses. And because of all the roads that washed away, was then taking my brother like 45 minutes to drive to her house. So you can just imagine the issues related to emergency services and, if getting things delivered to local stores, it became, it really shows how fragile our communities can be to flooding and its significant impacts. So much of what I'll be talking about today, we cover in this report that we released. I have a puppy who's done with me being on Zoom calls for the day. So I just apologize, she's in the background. So this is a report we released a little bit after the first of the year, and it's an update on a report we had published in 2017. And what we had found when we released that initial report was that while health professionals understood the importance of clean water, most of them aren't aware of the myriad of threats that face clean water here in the United States. And so this new report, we really streamlined it. The first report, we kind of were just so shocked at so many of the different threats to clean water that we kind of threw everything in the kitchen sink in the report. So this one's a little more streamlined, user-friendly. And what I really like that we did, we were able to interview a number of nurses around the country who have experienced water issues with their clients in their communities, and have highlighted ways that nurses and other health professionals can be engaged in their communities to help support clean water and health, and supporting strong water policies and regulations. So as you probably know, water sanitation is considered one of the greatest public health achievements of the 20th century. However, far too many people in the United States don't have access to clean water when they turn on the tap. And every year it's estimated that in the United States, our healthcare system spends almost $3 billion on waterborne illnesses, and millions of Americans are sickened by water contamination. According to the World Health Organization, almost 6% of the global burden of disease is due to poor water, sanitation, and hygiene. And as we know, clean water is essential to providing health care. When you think of how many times as health professionals we wash our hands throughout the day, or the amount of laundry that's washed in the hospital every day, the number of babies that are getting their first bath, it's just the amount of water we use is really immense, and we can't do our jobs without access to clean water. And hospitals and other healthcare facilities are the most water intensive facilities, and we account for about 7% of water used in industrial and commercial facilities in the United States. These are some of the significant key federal laws and regulations that impact water quality. Starting out with the Clean Water Rule and waters of the US. This falls under the Clean Water Act, and there's been a dispute under the Clean Water Act for years on determining which waters are regulated under federal law. The Clean Water Act prohibits the discharge of pollutions into waters of the US, or they call it WOTUS, which is, I think, just an awkward little acronym. However, no clear definition of the waters of the US is in the Clean Water Act. And so it's up to the EPA to determine what are the waters of the US. And this rule, the waters of the US impacts drinking water of 1 in 3 Americans. So it's a really important rule to make sure that all Americans are having access to clean water. In 2015, the EPA under the Obama administration adopted the Clean Water Rule. And this rule attempted to clarify once and for all exactly which waters would be protected under the Clean Water Act. It included language on certain wetlands and streams that, based on science, were determined to be vital to other navigable sources. And these are things like we see here in New Hampshire, where you have water runoff in the winter when you have snows melting, and you have streams that maybe aren't, that have water in them throughout the year, but they're really important for other bodies of water, for our drinking water system that are downstream. In preparation for the rule, they reviewed over 1,200 peer-reviewed documents, and they held extensive public comment periods. And from all of this work, they also wrote a report that highlighted the public health implications of pollution in upstream sources that have downstream impacts, and the importance of protecting these upstream water sources. Potential pollution avenues include waterborne pathogens being transported through headwaters to downstream waters, wastewater contaminants from both industrial and municipal sources that contain pollutants and pathogens, and the role of tributaries and storm drains in waterborne disease outbreaks, as stormwater can overwhelm treatment plants and eventually contaminate water sources. Fortunately, this rule was repealed in 2019 under the Trump administration, again limiting waters that receive federal protection. Now, under the Biden administration, they're looking to go back to the pre-2015 rule while they make updates and strengthen beyond what was included in that 2015 Obama administration rule. The Safe Drinking Water Act authorized the EPA to set national health standards for drinking water. Millions of Americans receive high-quality drinking water every day from their public water systems. Threats to safe drinking water include lead and copper from pipes, bacteria from animal waste, algae bloom, chemical contaminations, and other sources. While the EPA sets national standards or maximum contaminant levels for drinking water, states can set more protective standards if they choose. And we're seeing this with contaminants like PFAS, where states are taking the lead and setting more protective MCLs. And then finally, the lead and copper rule. This rule was adopted by the EPA in 1991, and it's a regulation to limit the concentration of lead and copper allowed in public drinking water, the consumer's tap. And it also makes them so they have to limit the amount of corrosion occurring in the water that can cause lead and copper to leach from pipes. And if you remember what happened in Flint, this was the issue why they had significant lead in drinking water there, as the corrosion controls had changed and failed. There's no safe level of lead. Exposures in children can negatively affect neurodevelopment, and exposures in adults are associated with high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. Black and other people of color are more likely to be exposed to lead in water, as well as other sources like paint. In 2021, the EPA revised the lead and copper rule for the first time since it was enacted in 1991. In the summer of 2021, the EPA revisited this rule and held a series of roundtable discussions. These discussions allowed an opportunity for stakeholders to provide comments, and there was a robust presence by nursing and health organizations in support of a health-based action level, expedition of full replacement of lead service lines, and the strengthening of monitoring requirements. Water infrastructure in the US encompasses drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. A 2015 study by the Natural Resources Defense Council found that more than 27 million people in the US were being served by water systems that had reported health-based violations under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Many local treatment plants, especially those in poor and rural communities, are not able to afford the necessary updates to filter out contaminants. Besides being exposed to potentially harmful contaminants, we're losing a valuable resource. Up to 14 to 18% of drinking water is lost through leaks in our failing infrastructure system. Also, it doesn't impact everyone the same way. Almost 10% of American Indian and Alaska Native homes lacked adequate sanitation facilities, and approximately 2% lacked access to safe drinking water, which is compared to 1% of the general US population. With funding from the infrastructure bill that was passed last year, and we're hoping, fingers crossed, more funding if Build Back Better moves forward, we're going to have an opportunity to provide input so that those water infrastructure funds go to the communities who need it most. We're continuing to put pressure on the Biden administration to make good on their promise to ensure the most impacted communities and low-income communities have their infrastructure needs addressed first and have adequate access to federal funds. Most recent estimates identify a need of, this is an unbelievable number, $743 billion for maintenance and repair of our country's water infrastructure system. And as I had said, there's no safe level of lead exposure. An estimated 15 to 22 people in the US are still served by community water systems that contain lead. And in 2015, over 18 million people were served by water systems that violated the EPA's lead and copper rule. Giving children's increased vulnerability to lead hazards, it's imperative that exposure to lead is eliminated to the greatest extent possible. One of these ways is through addressing lead and copper in our schools and daycare facilities. The current EPA action level in water of 15 parts per billion is not a health-based standard. Therefore, if there's lead water testing in schools or childcare facilities that show levels below 15 parts per billion, there's no requirement for action to get these lead levels as close to 0 parts per billion as possible. Compounding this problem is the fact that water isn't just used for drinking and washing, it's also used for cooking, where it winds up in foods like rice and pasta, or in baby formula, posing a greater risk to babies who consume more water proportionate to their size than adults. Climate change impacts our water sources in a number of different ways. Both droughts and flooding conditions can increase the risk of waterborne illnesses. Climate-related water events also have significant impact on water infrastructure. It's estimated that the necessary climate-related improvements needed to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change on our water supply will cost upwards of $944 billion through 2050. Stormwater runoff can contaminate water sources, leading to an increased risk of gastrointestinal illness and other waterborne diseases. In an analysis of fecal blood contamination on beaches in the US, more than 1 in 10 beaches surveyed were found to have potentially unsafe levels at least 25% of the time on the days that were sampled. Sewage overflow and stormwater runoff pollution are the major contributors to the unsafe bacteria found on the beaches. And actually, where my mom lives in Alstead, when they had the flooding in 2005, they did have a similar, excuse me, problem with all of the wells, even though she lived on much higher ground from where the flooding occurred, because of how all of the different groundwater sources interact with one another. Everyone in that area had contaminated well water and had to use bottled water for a pretty significant amount of time before the well water was safe to drink. Conversely, in drought conditions that lead to a limited water supply, this can reduce access to clean and safe drinking water. Changes that affect water resources impact both infrastructure as well as water-intensive sectors such as manufacturing and agriculture. In addition to the impacts of pollution from surface runoff, increased temperatures due to climate change also threatens water quality in rivers and lakes. As warming increases, surface water temperatures increase and affects aquatic life when species are unable to adapt to the rise in temperature. Water temperature also contributes to the proliferation of harmful bacteria and algae blooms, with the algae bloom season projected to be longer and more severe in future droughts. Blue-green algae, which actually is a cyanobacteria, produces cyanotoxins that can cause significant health impacts and even death if ingested or come into contact with skin through swimming or boating. Boiling water does nothing to impact the toxicity of cyanotoxin. And famously, residents in Toledo, Ohio, weren't able to use the public water system for several days due to an algal bloom in Lake Michigan. And in talking with people there, like one of the biggest challenges in Toledo was the public health system. How do you get the word out to folks that they can't use the water from their taps? And this is something that we're going to be facing more and more often as the climate changes. Also, our reliance on fossil fuels for energy exacerbates not only the climate crisis, but it also threatens our freshwater sources. Estimates suggest that fossil fuel and nuclear power plants utilize as much water as all of the farms in the United States put together, and more than 4 times that used by all of the residences in the United States. Climate change is also making, oh my gosh, there's a typo. Extreme weather events more frequent and more severe. As we saw in the devastation in Puerto Rico with Maria, the patterns of hurricanes we're now experiencing can be devastating. They move more slowly, have greater wind speeds, and drop significant amounts of precipitation. Low income and some communities of color, again, may bear the burden of these impacts as they don't have the resources to escape from weather, nor the resources to rebuild. When a family is struggling to put food on the table and pay their electric bill, evacuating may seem like an impossible challenge. Just in Florida alone, there are over 8 million people at risk of not being able to evacuate in the event of a hurricane due to lack of resources. Extreme weather events can put those impacted at greater risk of food and waterborne illnesses, cause a lack of access to healthcare, and disrupt community support systems. Healthcare institutions also need to address their preparedness for these events. For example, when New York was hit by Hurricane Sandy, many hospitals had their backup generators in the basements of their hospitals, which were quickly flooded and required the evacuation of whole facilities. And I don't know if any of you remember, there were some really, I think, kind of famous photos of NICU nurses carrying NICU babies being evacuated out of hospitals in New York City because of the failure of their generators. And these disasters are incredibly costly. In 2016, there were 15 weather and climate disaster events exceeding $1 billion each overall. And you can see that many of these have are water type events, whether it's from drought, flooding, storms, wildfires caused by drought. Overall, these events resulted in the deaths of 138 people and had significant economic impacts on the areas impacted. Since 1980, the number of severe storms has increased by over 800%. During 2017, the US experienced a historic year of weather and climate disasters, with 16 separate billion-dollar disasters events tying it with 2011 for the record number of billion-dollar disasters in an entire calendar year. And most notably was the cumulative cost, which exceeded $300 billion in 2017, which was a new US annual record. And when I hear these statistics, all I can think about is all the amazing things that we could do with all of that money. When you think of, addressing healthcare or educational system, it's just, breaks my heart that we're in this situation now. And then our water quality and supply. Throughout the US and globally, we're seeing changing weather patterns that are leading to flooding and drought. Water scarcity increases the risk of a contamination with infections, as well as toxins and other contaminants in the water. In many parts of the world, water scarcity has led women to traveling long distances to procure water. Up to 85% of their day is spent getting water, leading to increased exposure to heat and increased risk of violence along their routes, as well as decreased opportunities for economic gain, as their opportunity in other areas is significantly compromised by the time that's spent getting water. In areas with flooding and mudslides, there can be increased risk of infectious diseases such as cholera. And in areas with flooding may contaminate wells with bacteria and other toxins, making the water unsafe to drink. For low-income residents, water scarcity can make procuring safe, clean water challenging. And this isn't happening in other countries. This is happening here in the US. Throughout the US, families have had their water turned off when they're unable to pay increasing charges for water, or if they're on private wells that have run dry and are no longer a source of water for their home. There are many families in the US who are rationing water as they don't have access to running water and the cost of bottled water is prohibitive. And then this is Laura Andercoke here, who's working on one of the emerging contaminants that I wanted to talk about today. And this is something that I know has been an issue here in New Hampshire, is around PFAS. And PFAS is a very large class of chemicals that all contain a fluorine-carbon bond, which is the strongest synthetic bond known to man. They're used in a variety of different items, including firefighting foam, nonstick cookware, water-resistant outdoor wear, anti-stain treatments on textiles and cosmetics and food packaging. Because of that fluorine bond, they don't break down in the environment, even during incineration, and have been recently found in surface waters across the US. And in New Hampshire, it's near that the former Peace Air Force Base, or Air Force, Navy, but it's in Portsmouth. They're finding, and through the United States, we're finding this around a lot of military bases, as well as other manufacturing sites that use this. PFAS chemicals are linked to a number of health impacts, including testicular and kidney cancer, liver damage, reproductive issues, negative pregnancy impacts, high cholesterol. And something that I'm very concerned about during the pandemic is immunosuppression, where they're finding that vaccines may not develop the type of immune response that we would like them to have. Unfortunately, there's currently no mandated testing requirements for public water systems, and the non-enforceable lifetime health advisory for PFAS set by the EPA, which is 70 parts per trillion, is much higher than the limit of 1 parts per trillion supported by scientific evidence. So there's a lot going on around this issue right now, and lots of opportunities for health professionals to engage on this. For example, with Dr. Andercoke here, she's part of a working group at the National Academy of Science and Medicine. We'll be releasing a report within the next few months on guidance for health professionals on testing and health outcomes for PFAS. So be on the lookout for that. And I just wanted to close with a few different water and health policy recommendations where I think as health professionals, we can really be using our trusted health voices to help push both our legislators and the EPA and other regulatory agencies to really be addressing some of these clean water issues. One is on the update to the waters of the US. We think this is perfect timing. It's the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And so we think it's a perfect opportunity for the EPA to reaffirm all the amazing work that's been done under the Clean Water Act, but then to say that we need to move farther and stronger. We need strong action now, and especially with the threats to clean water that we're facing from climate change, we really don't have any time to lose as far as making sure that all of our communities have access to clean, healthy drinking water. And so one of the things we're saying is that they need to go back to the pre-2015 rule, but then also very quickly use the latest scientific evidence, because now it's been 8 years since that rule was put into place. And so we really need them to be moving quickly. This also ensures that things like wetlands that filter out water pollution from our waterways and guard against storms, flood, and seawater sea level rise are protected. There's definitely these, there's climate impacts related to our water supply across the board. And by having a strong Clean Water Act and updating the waters of the US can really have a positive impact on our resilience related to the climate impacts to our water. And then there's a number of strong actions that can be taken to help protect clean water in our communities. These include supporting funding and upgrades to water infrastructure in our country. And in the infrastructure bill that was passed last year, they did include $55 billion in new funding for water infrastructure over the next 5 years. But again, we need to make sure it's going to those communities that are most in need and those that have the least resources to be fixing their water infrastructure. We also need to be supporting a just transition from fossil fuel and water intensive energy production to clean energy such as wind and solar, due to the use of water both in fossil fuel extractive industries like fracking, but then in our power plants that use fossil fuels that use such significant amounts of water. And then to advance legislation such as the PFAS Action Act of 2021 and regulations that establish requirements and incentives to limit the use of different toxic contaminants like PFAS, so that we make sure that the clean water that we do have is protected, and we're not introducing new and untested contaminants to our precious clean water drinking sources. So thank you so much. I know it's a very quick overview with lots of information, but I look forward to answering questions and any discussion that we might have about some of these water issues facing the United States and the world right now.
Great. Thank you, Katie. That was really good. It seems to me that sometimes we think about things like carbon footprint and emissions gases, and water is so approachable. And it really, when we talk about sort of social determinants of health, water is really one of those things that is so impacted by social determinants of health. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's something that when we talk about eco-anxiety and things that people really can think about doing, water is really something that impacts our everyday life. So I think that you really brought that to life for us. So I think that was great. I'm just going to kind of go through some things in the chat. Samra had said, again, another social determinant of health is that finding water prevents many girls in the global South and Middle East from attending school and completing their education, which further compromises their economic and social well-being.
Yeah, and well, actually, one of the projects that we work on, where we've been partnering with Project Drawdown, and we've created Nurses Drawdown, which is, we've taken some of the science from Project Drawdown and we picked some of their resources that we thought had the greatest health impacts or would really appeal to nurses. And one of those is around gender equity. And so educating girls and access to family planning, and that's actually in their top 10 of things that we can do to draw down carbon, is educating girls. And so, definitely having access to clean water and being able to, attend school on a regular basis, is something that we're very supportive of and see the climate links.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for that, Katie. And it does go along, I think, with so many of the efforts around reforestation and work that women are doing themselves that connect to reproductive justice also. So thank you for that.
Definitely.
There's another comment about nuclear energy. So nuclear energy, it says, was suggested as a solution for energy production. Do you have a sense if this is a solution that is being suggested by the Biden administration? And what is the Nurses Association position in the use of nuclear energy as a source for energy production? And I just want to preface this by saying that last night, so we had a conversation about how much do we get into advocacy and policy, and really trying to figure out what our positions are. And perhaps, suggesting legislation in the next legislative session. So do you have a sense of where federal is going and what that might help guide us for the state?
So I know federally in some of the different climate packages, like it has been included with not that they specifically need to be using it, but as an option. But I do think that for many parts of the country, nuclear is not really a good option because it's incredibly expensive. It takes a very long time to build a plant. And so I think that for a lot of our energy companies, they're really not looking at that as a viable solution right now. I think there's only one construction plan that's maybe just finishing in South Carolina, but that's the only one in the United States, I believe. A lot of our groups that we work with are opposed to nuclear because of some of the issues related to radiation and potential problems. It's also incredibly water intensive. So if you're looking at areas that could potentially be in a drought condition, it could worsen some of these water access issues.
And certainly the drought conditions are leading to a lot of these natural disasters, that large scale wildfires and those kinds of things. Would you agree?
Oh, definitely. And what we're seeing with climate change is, you get areas that keep getting tons and tons of rain, and then you get other areas that are getting no rain at all, and they kind of get stuck in these cycles. And so we're going to keep seeing more and more of this, where some parts of the country are experiencing all of the issues related to flooding, while others are experiencing the issues related to drought. And I think it's going to be really challenging in some of these Western states figuring out, how to give folks access to enough clean drinking water. I mean, they're already rationing water in certain parts of the country because they really don't have, enough coming through those areas to satisfy the demands.
Here's a question. Many New Hampshire communities have wells. So you talked a lot about lead and those things. As far as you know, are there well water testing resources that the homeowner could use?
Yeah, this is a real challenge. And I know I've experienced it with my mom. The water testing can be very expensive. And so if you have a low income homeowner, they're not going to be testing their water as often as it's recommended. I think the New Hampshire, I guess the Department of the Environment, they do have resources on their website that link to what they recommend the testing should be. But if you're testing, I think probably the minimum cost is, several $100s. And I believe you're supposed to test it every year or so. Is somebody
Yeah,
on from the?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was
like,
going to say,
"Yay, come
Karen,
on."
Karen, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
And
Sure,
interesting.
sure.
Can you also talk about arsenic? Arsenic had also come up in the comments, and I know UNH had a large-scale project about arsenic testing in water.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are many very common contaminants in New Hampshire, including arsenic and radon. We see uranium as well. And then also, you know, the more we test, the more we are finding PFAS. There are a number of different resources available. So I'll throw some stuff in the chat. But I want to say for the standard analysis that the rate is not that high. PFAS testing becomes a little bit more expensive. But there is a site on within the New Hampshire DES site, people can request PFAS testing, you know, as part of the broader statewide investigation, and I'll include a link for that as well. And the Drinking Water Groundwater Trust Fund of New Hampshire just approved it's like a rebate program. So if people do find PFAS specifically in their water, they may be eligible for a rebate for treatments, just sort of a one-time. And so I can include the link for that as well. There are a number of exciting things happening. Our agency just hired a well water coordinator, and the Drinking Water Groundwater Trust Fund just is in process of starting up a program on the seacoast of New Hampshire to offer widespread well water testing to several seacoast communities, sort of as a pilot program that can hopefully be then rolled out statewide. And I think Senator Sherman is a member of this group. He was, instrumental in making the recommendation for that program. That was really his idea. So I'll throw some links in, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'll put my email address in there too. I can help connect folks to others at New Hampshire DES who can provide even more detail than me.
That's
That's
great. Thank you,
awesome.
Karen.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
I know I spend a lot of time in the summer at the Cape, and there's a lot of projects to decrease runoff into the bays so that they can bring back wildlife, and the use of oysters to bring back the sea life. Is there anything like that you know of in New Hampshire, or what do you suggest in terms of that? The runoff from we use a lot of salt in the winter for our roads, and those all runoff has to go into our water systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know of what particular programs there are in New Hampshire. I'm in Maryland, and so we have the Chesapeake Bay that's had a lot of runoff issues. And I know that what's really made a big difference is having a really broad coalition of groups, environmental groups, health groups, really coming together to look at what the issues are and how they can work together to address some of those runoff issues. Down here, we don't have as much of the, salt and de-icing. It's more farm runoff. So looking at that, but I think looking at creative ways to reduce our use of some of these different things that can potentially impact water quality, I think is the way to go.
Okay. So did you want to talk about, can you talk a little bit more specifically about the Build Back Better bill and maybe some things that our organization can get behind for that?
Totally. So I don't know if you all remember, there were two bills that we were hoping to have passed pretty quickly last year. One was the infrastructure bill, and then kind of its companion was Build Back Better. And they both do similar things. They both look at, broad infrastructure development, have a lot of climate change funding in there for communities to build in resilience and adaptation, so many different pieces that would get funding so we could really move quickly on strong climate action. And so they passed the infrastructure bill, but then Build Back Better has been stalled. It passed in the House, but not in the Senate. So Maggie Hassan is considered a key senator for really pushing her colleagues to bring it up for a floor vote, to try to push other senators to vote the right way, or the way we'd like them to. So that is, an excellent way for all of you to use your health professional voices, is call Maggie Hassan and say, please support Build Back Better. What can we do to help support you in pushing your colleagues to support this bill and push it for a vote?
Great. Here's a question about warming lakes. So what are you hearing about warming lakes and the increase of phytoplankton blooms? Yeah,
so that's similar to the algae blooms that I was talking about, the cyanobacteria. It's a huge issue. And you get the warming temperatures, and then also in areas where you get farm runoff can also increase the risk of those algae blooms, and they can have really significant health impacts. You can't swim in it, your pets can't swim in it. It can kill off other vegetation within the lake, disrupting that delicate balance in that body of water. So it's definitely something that we'll be seeing more of with rising global temperatures.
Great. There's a lot in the chat about the use of oysters. So oysters and climate change. So I think that's a topic that seems to be of interest to people. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I mean, so, they can definitely help filter things out, and they are kind of they can be
They're
like
garbage eaters, aren't they?
Yeah, they filter things out, and they're also a kind of like canary in a coal mine. If you can have like really healthy oyster beds, it's showing that the body of water around it is healthy as well. So you can use it as kind of a barometer of the health of the water.
Samara, did you want to say something? You were unmuted.
I'll say one really exciting thing, that some of the Project Echo work that we'll be doing with nurses and marine scientists is going to focus on this exact issue. And we've begun a conversation with nurses to start that work. So really exciting.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome.
And what's the role of the nurses? Just understanding?
And communicating, and we're going to do living laboratories visiting these sites so everyone involved can witness the amazing work that oysters do for us, as well as other environmental issues.
I know our house is on a bay, and they put oyster beds probably 5 years ago, and it's amazing how much cleaner that there's no more algae, and they've done it. Those little oysters have done an amazing job.
Yeah, and this is John actually, and you're right. The oysters, they do filter out all the pathogens in the water, and the thing is, you also have to get them tested periodically for things like Vibrio and foodborne illness, and that is being done when as needed, especially in New Hampshire. So yeah, I mean, the oyster is the canary in the coal mine for sure, and we've done research on looking at actually the shell accretion, so the calcium carbonate. Yeah, so you can look at you can go back and look at temperature variability in the surface water because the oxygen isotope has a certain signature, and you can go back and you can estimate what the trends are in the seasonal temperature variability. So that's another interesting tool that the oysters have, but I'll stop there. It's all very interesting. Thank you.
So I guess we haven't touched on lead and daycare. So are there federal funds for, daycare centers, especially in New Hampshire, are having trouble with workforce, so they're closing, but certainly we also want to keep them open and be safe. So are there federal funds that help mitigate lead in daycare centers?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the infrastructure funding, I know the EPA right now is looking at how they're going to be dispersing some of those funds to get rid of lead in drinking water. One of the things that we're recommending that's kind of a stopgap measure, but it can be a little more inexpensive, is to just have a water filtration system, and instead of trying to replace all of the pipes within a daycare or school setting. But like if you're like at the airport and they've got a thing where you can fill up your water bottle, it's like a filtration system. Like, so schools and daycares, I know like in Michigan, they've had a bill put forward to provide funding to schools and daycares in Michigan. So they're just saying, forget about testing, because you can get lead in the water system from so many different sources within the school. Just put in these water filtration systems where the kids can just fill up their water bottles, or they use it for cooking in the school, that filters out the lead. So you kind of, I think it's a significantly more inexpensive than trying to both test and figure out where you need to replace all the different pieces within the water system.
Do you know of any tests that are being done on lakes? So if I did live on a lake and I wanted to have my water tested, is there a matter of course that I could request that?
I would defer to Karen on this. What the New Hampshire, what's available, because different states have different kind of testing requirements that happen at bodies of water.
So you were asking, sorry, I was typing in some of the resources. So you were asking specifically about like surface water testing, like not drinking water testing, but surface water testing?
Right. If I lived on a lake and I wanted to make sure, my kids are going to go swimming that day, is the lake clean?
So I'm going to say that I will find the answer for you and put it in the chat.
Okay. I was interested about the immunosuppression comments. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so, I'd say there's early research that's showing that folks that have higher levels of PFAS in their system do not have as strong a response to vaccines, like immune response. And so that's an area that I think a lot of research is going on in right now. Like we're seeing this, but we don't know how it actually then translates like on a population scale. But I know that folks that are really active around PFAS, health professionals and scientists have been very concerned about this during the pandemic, because they're like, people that are in areas with higher levels in their water, could they be having decreased response to the COVID vaccine? Like, could we see spikes in those areas because they're just not responding as well?
Okay, interesting. All right, Bob, we're coming up to the end. I don't know if I should throw it back to you for any final comments.
I just want to thank Katie for a wonderful presentation on an important topic, and thank all of you for joining us this evening.
Katie, there's a lot of, I don't know if you can see the chat, but there's a lot of great comments and resources. So for anybody who, Karen put a lot of good links into the chat, and hopefully people will be able to access those. ANHE has been really great in helping the New Hampshire Nurses Association develop their Commission on Climate, Health and Action. So, we really use them as a resource. Encourage people to go to their website, because it's really for nurses. We really appreciate your help with this issue and bringing it forward. And so thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Take care.
Bye.